In this lesson, we'll see some of the varieties effects that we can achieve using the car paint phenomena shader. So to start off in this scene, we have just the simple front end of a car setup. So what we're going to do is see how we can utilize this car paint phenomena as a way of getting these very realistic shading effects. So right now, if we were to just take a quick render at what we have right now, you see that we just have a simple blend material that's assigned to this front end of the car. And you can see that it doesn't do a terrible job of simulating kind of these shiny reflective environments that we would want. But what we'll see is with the car paint shader, we can actually get something that is much more realistic. So what I'm going to do is start by saving this image for comparison's sake. And let's go over to the hypershade and drop in our material. So we'll use the car paint phenomena. And in our case, let's just right click on the blend, select all the objects with this material. That'll automatically grab all our objects. And then with the car paint phenomena, we'll just right click and assign to selection. So that way everything that had a blend now has the car paint shader. So just for comparison, without making any adjustments, let's just see the change that we've made. And you can see that immediately, once the render is complete, that we do, without having to make any sort of adjustments to this, we do get these very, very deep, sort of glossy reflections. So if you compare what we had before, where we have something that's very flat and even looking by comparison, we now have these really nice kind of darker areas and in these places of the model that are a little bit more indirectly visible to our camera. In these areas that are more directly pointing toward us, you can see how we get this nice deep red color. Now you will notice that we do have a few kind of problem areas that are right in here as far as these little spots and noise areas are concerned. Now we'll address those here in just a moment. But what we want to do first is just kind of take a look at some of these attributes that are controlling this shader. So let's go over here. Let's start with the base color. This is really just the underlying color for our shader. Right now it's set to a red color, but if we were to change this to anything that we want, you can see how that will change basically this main color here, and this might be a little bit easier to see if I were to pull this open here in the hypershade. There we go. Now you can see that we do have this little red spot right in the middle. This is being controlled by the lit color. So really this would probably just be a brighter version of whatever you have set as your main light color or your underlying base color. There we go. So you can start to see how we can use these in combination with each other to start to get some fairly realistic effects. Now we also have the edge color, which are these areas of the shader that are going to be most indirectly visible by the camera. Right now it's set to black, which is why we start to get kind of this fall off toward these really deep dark colors as we get farther outside the object. Now again, we can control that and start to set this to anything that we want. So with this set to red, you can see how we get this very red type of color on the outside. Now we can control the actual fall off from our edge color to our base color with this edge color bias. So if I were to control and then left click and drag, you can see how by increasing this we start to choke in this edge color and it starts to make more of an appearance on the shader itself. Likewise, if we wanted to choke this back to where the edges are only visible on the outermost areas, we can start to decrease this value, this bias, and you can see how these red colors are now really kind of limited to just these areas that are very, very far outside. Now below the lit color, we have this lit color bias, and what we can start to do with this is begin sort of increasing or decreasing the area of effectiveness of our lit color. So you can see with a higher bias how our lit color starts to get choked back down until we're just limited to kind of these very small little areas. So it kind of gives us a way of choking down and really concentrating the illuminated portion of the light. And then finally below that we have the edge weight and the edge bias as well. So these can kind of work in combination with each other as far as you can see how with this increased bias we start to really choke down this diffuse color to the point where it really has no effect on these outer areas. So with this bias set to a little bit higher value, or rather a lower value, we should now start to see the actual diffuse being very heavily scattered toward the outside. Normally, you would probably want to leave this set to its default value of 1, and then make your adjustments to the shader with some of these other attributes. So in our case, let's try to give this car a little bit more of a orange type of paint shader. So we'll start with the edge color. Something that's very, very close to black makes a good edge color. So in our case, we actually want to set the base color, which is the attribute I was adjusting here, to something that's a little bit brighter, a little more easy to see. So let's maybe start now with this edge color. And if we want, we can start to introduce a very slight edge color onto this. And then finally, for the lit color, we can start to give this just kind of, again, a brighter version of our base color. And there we go. So let's take a look at what we have. And really you can see how with very little effort we can start to get these really nice, deep, glossy sort of painting on effects. So below this we have the specular parameters. Now these control the specular weighting that we have here. This might be a little bit easier to see if we were to take this lit color and drop this all the way down. And we might go ahead and just take the edge color and the base color and drop that down as well. So that way it becomes a little bit easier to see the actual specular result isolated by itself. So really this behaves in a method very similar to the fast subsurface specular results, or rather the skin results. So with the exponent we can start to increase this. You can see how with a little bit higher exponent we should start to get now a little bit stronger specular effect. You can see how that will really kind of start to choke this specular result down if you compare something that has a much lower value. So you can see with a specular exponent of 2, we get this very, very wide spread out specular highlight. Alright, so as you can see we actually have 2 different layers of specularity. One for the topmost level, and then one for this underlying level. So you can see that we actually do have 2 specular highlights, this little tighter one, and then this softer outermost one. So with this secondary one, with the second specular results, we could start to come in and maybe begin colorizing these a little bit if we choose to. We can also start to increase the weighting or decrease those as we see fit. And again, we have really 2 different specular highlights to control. So if we want one of these to be a little bit softer and a little bit more diffuse, we can always lower the specular exponent on one and start to heavily increase the specular exponent on the other and start to get a little higher, tighter results. And we can probably see what this looks like in comparison. And you can start to see how that will now give us a little bit more of a stylized sort of appearance. And we now have these sort of orange specular highlights that are beginning to appear. And again, this would probably be used best in combination with something that has a little bit of orange already in it. Alright, so let's come back in and start to make just a couple of final adjustments to our shaders before we wrap up this lesson. So once I get this set back, we'll start to focus on the flake patterns that we have here. So let's go ahead and just take one more second to set this back. So let's take a look now at the actual flakes that we have. So this is what's responsible for the sort of little lighter colored speckled areas that we have here, and this is simulating sort of that metallic underpaint that you can find oftentimes on a lot of different types of cars. So let's start by first just increasing the flake scale. You can see that obviously our flake size is far too big for what we have right now. So let's start by really lowering this down, something like 0.01, and you can start to see now how we get a little more focused, smaller little flakes. We also have control over the weighting of the flakes, so how dense they are. So right now with this set to a very low weight, you can see that these flakes are very, very subtle. But we can set those up to a 1 or even a higher value if we want to get a little bit more emphasis on these. We can also control how reflective they are. Below that we have the exponent, which will control how quickly these flakes die off from the center, or rather the more illuminated areas of our shader, to these outermost areas that are not quite so well illuminated. So with a higher exponent, this will start to get limited down to just these areas of illumination, which is ideally probably what we would want. So let's just start to take a look at what this will give us. And you can see how that will start to do a really nice job of concentrating these flakes into just some of these little smaller areas. Now, I had mentioned a little bit earlier in this lesson that we do have a bit of a problematic area, and that is right along here. And this was a little bit more apparent in some of our earlier renders, which I actually did not manage to take a result of. So if we were to increase this flake scale a little bit more, this will become much more apparent. And this is a problem that comes about as a result of actually having pieces of geometry that don't have their scaling values matched. because the actual flake distribution is based on your object's local scale. So if we were to take a look at this, you can see that right now the car hood has all its translation and transformations frozen. Same thing with the rest of the body, but this piece of geometry, even though it occupies the exact same space, its local coordinates are set very differently. So as a result, the shader is calculated much differently on this piece of geometry. So to fix it, all we have to do is just basically freeze all the transformations. So we'll freeze those. There we go. That'll zero everything out. And now let's save this for comparison and see what that does for us. And now that's resolved the problem. So anytime you have any sort of areas on your geometry, if you're using this car paint shader, that has some of these little flakes and areas that don't seem to be matching up quite right, first thing you'll want to do is check all the translations and transformations and make sure everything is zeroed out, ideally, or at least matched to the exact same values. So before we wrap up this lesson, let's take just a quick look at some of the reflection and dirt parameters. So we have the reflection color, and we have below that the edge factors and edge weights. So this controls the amount of reflectivity as we get further out toward the edge of our object. So below